Thank you. Wait a minute. This is diet.
Hello everybody, welcome back to Chain of Commander, your source for general chit-chat on the Commander format. This is your Commander-in-Chief, Billy G here, coming to you today to let you know that sometimes it's okay to be the bad guy. That's why I present to you for your consideration this month's Chief's Choice deck tech, my own personal Zozu the Punisher deck list. Now, before we get into it, I do ask that if you end up enjoying this deck tech, definitely consider subscribing below. I'd love to have you folks join us going forward. And you know what? While you're down there, you'll also find a link in the description to this deck list so that you can reference it at your leisure. That said, let's get into it here. Zozu the Punisher. 1 red for a 2/2 Goblin Warrior that says whenever land enters the battlefield, Zozu does 2 damage to that land's controller. And that's what Zozu's all about. Punishing people for just playing Magic. How dare they? And there are a lot of effects in this deck that go about punishing people for simply just playing a game of Magic. So let's go over some of those, shall we? First, we have Anka Mishra, which very similar to Zozu, does 2 damage to a player whenever they put a land in the battlefield. Dingus Egg, which is going after people's lands who end up going to the graveyard. So fetch lands and forced destruction of lands get punished by Dingus Egg. Acidic Soil is a one-shot damage-dealing sorcery that does damage to players equal to the amount of lands they control. We got some moons. We got Blood Moon. And we got Magus of the Moon, both of which turn non-basic lands into mountains. And then we also have the Blood Sun, which takes away all non-mana abilities from lands. We have a couple things that punish people for playing non-basics. We got Burning Earth, which does damage whenever they tap a non-basic for mana. And similar to Acidic Soil, we have Price of Progress, which is a one-time damage dealer that does damage relative to the amount of non-basic lands somebody controls. Then if people want to try to use their lands, we have Storm Cauldron, which punishes them for tapping their lands for mana by bouncing that land to their hand. We got Mana Barbs, which punishes them for tapping their lands for mana by doing damage to them. Price of Glory, which punishes them for tapping their lands for mana on other people's turns by destroying that land. Take that, control. And then we also have, for those who think they can get around this by not tapping their lands at all, we have Citadel of Pain, which does damage to players equal to the amount of untapped lands at their end step. Beyond that, we have some other little effects here that can deal incremental damage as the game goes on. We have Cavalier Flame, which when he dies, does damage to each opponent equal to the amount of lands they control. Or, not that. Lands you control in your graveyard. Glinthorn Buccaneer, which does 1 damage to each opponent whenever you discard a card. And he has a built-in looting effect if you are attacking with him. Then there's Harsh Mentor, which does 2 damage to a player whenever they activate an ability of a creature, artifact, or land that isn't a mana ability. And then Torbrand, Variant of the Red Fell, which punishes people for being punished by punishing them extra more. Now, being in red, ramp isn't necessarily our forte, and we are specifically looking for mana or artifact-based ramp in this deck because lands can be at the mercy of the rest of the deck. So we pump in some good ones here. We got Soul Ring and we got Mana Crypt. Both can tap for double colorless. We also have Worn Power Stone, which enters tap, but can also tap for double colorless. We have Thought Vessel to tap for colorless and also can give us an unlimited hand size, though doesn't really come up too much. Mind Stone, which taps for colorless and can be sacked for a card draw later in the game. And Hedron Archive, which, similar to Mind Stone, actually is a double Mind Stone, costs twice as much, taps for twice as much mana, sacks for twice as many cards. Then we have Arcane Signet, Fire Diamond, and Iron Myrrh, all 3 of which can just tap for red. We have Crow Mox, which when it enters the battlefield, you can imprint a non-land card from your hand, and it can tap for any color of that card. In our deck, we need to make sure that it is a red card because this does not work with colorless cards. And then we also have Mox Diamond, which when it enters the battlefield, you got to discard a land, or else you got to sack the Mox Diamond there. Gilded Lotus, which can tap for 3 of colored mana, in our case, probably red. And Thran Dynamite, which taps for 3 colorless. We have 2 mana rocks that aren't really mana rocks, but they help us out. We got Ruby Medallion, which makes all of our red spells cost 1 generic mana less. And Cage Sun, which when it enters the battlefield will be naming red, so that all our red sources amongst our lands produce an extra red, and all of our red creatures get a little bit of a buff. And then lastly, we do have Dockside Extortionist, which when he enters the battlefield, brings along enough treasures with them equal to the amount of enchantments or artifacts our opponents control. Now, not only with ramp does red have issues with, but red also has issues with card advantage. So we have 2 primary forms of card advantage here. The first of which is being able to use our lands from our graveyard. We're going to be sending a lot of lands to our graveyard. We have to be able to get them back. So for that regards, we have Crucible of Worlds that lets us play lands from our graveyard, so that lands in the graveyard are essentially an extension of our hand. We also play Tectonic Reformation so that we can cycle lands away for further draws, so that we can cycle land away, play that as our land for turn, also get a card draw out of it. Then we also have some wheel effects. We have 2 wheels that just draw us as many cards as we're discarding, so Corveth's Fury and Molten Psyche, both of which can also damage our opponents depending on the choices you make or if you have Metalcraft. Then we have 3 actual wheels, which lets us draw a full 7. We have Reforge the Soul, which is cheaper if we get it under its miracle cost. We have Magus of the Wheel, which has an activated ability to mirror the classic Wheel of Fortune. And then we also have the actual Wheel of Fortune here. So 3 cards that can give us a full grip, especially if we get them later in the game when our hands are almost empty, come in really handy. We also need to make sure that we can remove any problematic things our opponents might have. So we have Duplicant, which can exile a creature. Seismic Assault, which can turn extra lands in hand into damage to bolt things down. Shattering Spree, which can destroy some artifacts and can be replicated. Vandal Blast, which can either destroy 1 artifact, or if you overload it, can destroy all the artifacts your opponents control. Then we got some board clears. We got Magma Quake, Starstorm, which has cycling on it, Blasphemous Act, which is cheaper the more creatures there are out there, Chain Reaction, which does more damage the more creatures there are out there, and Hour of Devastation. Hour of Devastation might be the best board clear in this deck, specifically because it does 2 things that red normally has issues with. It takes away creatures indestructible, and it also hits planeswalkers. 2 things that this deck, when I was in early drafting of it, had some severe issues with. So super good board clear in that deck. Then we also have some board clears that aren't necessarily for the creature side, if you know what I mean. We have Wildfire, which does 4 damage to each creature, but also forces each player to sacrifice 4 lands. We have Devastating Dreams, which is similar to Wildfire, but it only costs red, and you discard X amount of cards from your hand at random, and then it deals that much damage to each creature and makes each player sacrifice that many lands. Then there's also Boil, to destroy all islands, because let's be real here, who wants to be playing against a blue deck? Ruination, which destroys all non-basic lands. Epicenter, which can destroy all the lands if you have Threshold. And Impending Disaster, which is kind of a weird card because it's an enchantment that at your upkeep checks to see how many lands are on the battlefield total, and if there are only 7 or more, it blows all the lands up. So, it's kind of a silly card in a multiplayer format, but alas, here we are. It's in our deck. Now, being a Zozu deck, we're clearly going to get targeted first if any pod is sane and realizes what we're trying to do. So we have some things in the deck to help prevent our early dismissal and stave our own execution. We have Silent Arbiter, which forces combat to be limited to a single attacker and a single blocker to prevent anybody from bum rushing us early on. Elixir of Immortality for incremental life gain gives us 5 life every time we activate it, and also there's niche situations where it shuffling our graveyard back into our deck can come in pretty handy. We got Lightning Greaves to give a creature hexproof and haste. Basilisk Collar, which can give our creatures Death Touch and Lifelink. This one will come in pretty handy. We're going to touch base on that one later. And last one, we have a land, but it's not really a land because it doesn't tap for mana, and that is Glacial Chasm, which prevents damage done to us and prevents us also from attacking, but we kind of use it to stabilize the board. And we'll get a little bit more into that one a bit later as well. We also have a couple utility artifacts here. We have Mirage Mirror, which can become a copy of pretty much anything, and Mycosynth Lattice, which turns everything at the table into an artifact. More on that one later. We also have some Planeswalkers. We have 2 Chandras. We have Awakened Inferno, because that one can give your opponents emblems that does damage to them every upkeep, and Torch of Defiance to help generate mana, and also some relative card advantage. We have Duretti Scrap Servant, which will then, mainly we use him for his looting effect, but there's also situations where we might want to do the Goblin Welder ability and swap an artifact and from our battlefield and our graveyard. And then we have Cough of the Hammer. You're going to have a bunch of mountains out there. Might as well swing in with them once in a while. Just smash people with a 4/4. And then we get to our lands. Just because we like destroying other people's lands doesn't mean we want to not have lands of our own. So we have our deserts. We got the original desert, Desert of the Fervent, which has cycling, as does Forgotten Cave. It also has cycling. Dunes of the Dead, so that if it ever gets destroyed from the battlefield, will give us the bonus 2/2 zombie. Hostile Desert, which is a creature land which can take advantage of the fact that we'll have plenty of land cards in our graveyard. Scavenger Grounds, to kind of hate on anybody using graveyard strategies by exiling graveyards. Sunscorched Desert, which when it enters just as a single damage to target player. Nothing crazy there. And then some lands that give us a little bit of extra reach. We have Ramping Up Ruins, which is the desert that when you sack deserts can do 2 damage to each opponent. That's 6 damage every activation. Shiving Gorge, which can do damage to each opponent. And Valakut the Molten Pinnacle, which if you have enough mountains will start doing 3 damage to things. Then we also have Lotus Field and Ancient Tube. These are 2 lands that can tap for more than 1 mana. Lotus Field can tap for 3, but you gotta sack some lands when it enters the battlefield. And Ancient Tube can sack for 2 colorless, but does 2 damage to you. We also have Darksteel Citadel, specifically because it has Indestructible. This helps get around anything of ours that will be destroying lands. Now, if it's forcing us to sacrifice it, doesn't get us around that, but hey, we'll hedge what we can when we can. Then we have a bunch of targeted land removal amongst our lands. We got Dustpole, we got Field of Ruin, we got Ghost Quarter, we got Tectonic Edge, and we got Strip Mine. All to kind of remove individual lands that we might have issues with. And then wrap that up with 16 mountains, and you have yourself a complete Zozu the Punisher, or depending on how you played, Zozu the Mild Inconvenience. And you have that full deck right there. Now, that said, how does this deck win? It's fine and dandy to be doing damage to people for just playing Magic. It's fine and dandy to be destroying lands, but you're just becoming a nuisance if you have no direction to win the game. So there are 3 main strategies to this particular deck. The first one is the incremental damage. This would be any of the damage that you're doing just incrementally through the game from your opponent's playing Magic. So this would be Zozu himself, the Ankh of Mishra, all of those enchantments that do damage based off of lands affecting things, Torbrand to buff it up, that sort of stuff. You are going to be doing incremental damage as the game goes on to start wearing people down. Another way to kind of manage your board state and your board position through all this is through the accessible land management. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of the important ramp in this deck is artifact ramp, because there will be times where we want to clear out the lands without clearing out our mana sources. So that you want to load up on artifacts, artifact ramp, then destroy all the lands. And there's things like Crucible Worlds, which can also make it easier for us to start replaying lands again, and stuff like that, to help manage the amount of lands our opponents have access to. The thing about this particular part of the strategy is that you need to know where you are in terms of advantage on the board. If you blow up all the lands when you do not have the advantage, you are going to lose. If you blow up all the lands when everybody's at parity, everybody's going to be mad at you for extending the game much longer than it needs to be. Only blow up the lands once you have the advantage on the board, or you have a way to start taking people out. Please. I know it's fun to be the bad guy, but don't be bad without a cause. Be bad with a plan. Bad with a plan. The last main strategy of this deck would be you're going to be doing a lot of wheeling and discarding and cycling with this deck. So things like Lindhorn Buccaneer will come in handy. We'll doing pings everybody every time you cycle or discard a card. So you also have Elixir in there to reshuffle your library and keep going and going. And you have Duretti, which lets you loot and discard. So a lot of discarding in this deck. So Lindhorn Buccaneer lets you take advantage of that. And there's a couple key interactions overall for this deck that you really want to focus on. The first one is Basilisk Collar. If you could get this on Zozu, or if you could get this on Glinthorn, or if you can even get this on Harsh Mentor, then you can start gaining life whenever they're doing damage, and you can start breaking the symmetry that are the effects, and start gaining your life back. You're going to want to gain as much life as you can in here, but red isn't normally a life gain color. So a colorless source like Basilisk Collar comes in very handy, especially with this low mana cost and equip cost. You have it on Zozu. Every time your opponent plays a land, you gain 2 life. Every time you play a land, you'll take the 2 damage, but you'll gain the 2 life right back. You put it on Glinthorn. Every time you discard a card, Glinthorn will do 1 damage to each opponent. You'll be gaining 3 life. So great way to keep yourself stabilized life total-wise. The next one is Glacial Chasm and Crucible of Worlds. I mentioned earlier, Glacial Chasm is a way to prevent damage from being done to you, but it has an upkeep cost of paying life. If you don't pay that upkeep cost, you have to sack the Glacial Chasm. So if you're getting to a low life, you're going to not want to pay the upkeep cost anymore. But if you have Crucible out, you can just sack it at its upkeep to not paying its cumulative cost and just play it again for your land per turn and just keep doing that and keep looping that. And without paying life, you'll be able to prevent further damage from being done to you by other people's sources. And the last one is this is the big mean combo of the deck. This is Mycosynth Lattice, which like I said earlier, turns all your opponents' everything into artifacts. And Vandal Blast, which overloaded, destroys all artifacts you control. So with these two combined, you destroy all of the permanents your opponents control, leaving yours intact. So those are the key methods that this deck really goes out there to try to win. I hope that maybe you don't take inspiration from this list. I don't think other people out there want to see more Zozu decks. And actually, I don't think I want to play against a Zozu deck as much fun as they are to play. But if you did enjoy this deck list, if you are thinking about building a Zozu deck, or if you have a Zozu deck of your own, definitely let me know in the comments below. I'm very interested to see how other people take advantage of this deck, see what other strategies they implement to punish those who want to play Magic. Beyond that, thank you very much for joining me today. Like I said, if you're not subscribed and you enjoy this deck, consider subscribing below. I'd love to have you go joining us forward. I also thank you if you're already subscribed. Thank you very much. It means so much to me. And also, I recently started a Patreon to help kind of support the channel here. So if you're up for it, every dollar can help this channel grow. If you can't, no biggie. A simple like, a subscribe, a share, it goes so far. So thank you very much for joining me today. I'm looking forward to see you guys in the future. I hope you all take care. Adios and happy punishing.